So we talked about the peer-to-peer architecture in our previous video. Now we're going to talk about the client-server architecture. And what we want to focus on here is we want to focus on how it differs from the peer-to-peer architecture. So remember, in the peer-to-peer architecture, every single device on there shared resources and they also received resources. So we called them a peer because they were a combination of a client and a server. Well, in a client-server architecture, we only have clients and we only have servers. We don't have a combination of both. And so how does that differ? Well, clients receive resources on a client-server architecture and servers provide resources. So we don't have a peer that does both. We don't have a peer that receives resources and provide resources. In this architecture, we have dedicated servers that provide resources and we have dedicated clients that we use as employees in an organization to access those resources on the servers. And I have a really good example over here. We have a dedicated server here, and I'll highlight this so you see it. And it shares resources with the 4 systems on the network: Millie, Pluto, Mickey, and Louie. And with this, we can determine what type of access these people have, when they have access, and how they access it. And you'll notice is that we can control everything right here on the server. We can control their passwords, we can control what type of access they have, and we can also control when they have access. Now, a couple of other things to take away from this slide is that when we're talking about servers providing centralized control over network resources, we're not only talking about file servers. There can be all sorts of different servers on a network. We can have print servers to control who has access to what printers and when. We can have authentication servers to determine who has access to network and when, and it controls how they access it and how they log in. We can have streaming media servers for types of companies such as maybe we're Yahoo or we're a multimedia company, where we determine what type of media can be streamed across the network. And so there's all sorts of different resources that we can think about that can be shared on a network. And we really, in this architecture, we use servers to provide those resources. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the pros and cons. So we talked about the pros and cons of the peer-to-peer architecture. Let's talk about it for the client-server architecture. Because now that we understand that this is a more robust network and it provides greater cybersecurity and information security control, there's got to be some pros and there's got to be some cons. Well, the first major advantage is we do have that centralized control over everything on the network, on the user accounts, on the resources, and on access to the servers. And so that provides us greater security. It really simplifies how we manage the network. And having those two features, having enhanced security and really having simplified network administration, because we're only focused on securing and managing and backing up and making sure that data and information is there on the servers. We don't have to worry about the clients as much. Now, another benefit is that when we do go with this architecture, when we do set up servers, they're typically going to be a lot more robust than a client computer. They're going to cost a lot more. However, because they're more robust, they're going to be much more efficient in the way that they provide resources on the network. And so they scale up a lot easier, and they are going to be more efficient, and they're going to be a lot faster than if we had a peer-to-peer network. Another advantage is we have our single password. So remember when we had the peer-to-peer, everybody set up who had access to what on the machine, and they could set up whatever password they wanted. So if you had to connect to 4 or 5 different computers, you could potentially have to remember 4 or 5 passwords. However, in a client-server architecture, if we have an authentication server, then we set up a single password and everybody has access with one login to all the resources on the network. And so for those of you that work in a large environment like me, you're going to be used to this. So there's a lot of pros, and that's why all the larger organizations use a client-server architecture. However, there are disadvantages. So let's talk about those disadvantages. Well, the first one is, well, what happens if we have a server failure? What happens if our file server goes down? Well, it could potentially render the network unusable because we don't have access to the data that we need. And so we'll have a loss of resources on our network if it's not set up properly. And you can set these up with redundancy, but it's expensive. Now, another issue is the complexity. A client-server architecture is a lot more complex than the simple peer-to-peer architecture. You can't simply go down to Best Buy or go onto Amazon and buy 4 of the same laptops and set up a client-server architecture. you have to go to HP or Dell and you have to purchase server hardware and server software to set that up. And then you also have to set up your clients with client systems and client software. So it's a lot more complex and it's a lot more expensive, and it requires more expensive hardware and software, but it also requires expert staff. So we have to have system administrators, we have to have network administrators, we have to have help desk people and desktop support. So again, it's a lot more expensive. And this really increases our cost of ownership. And it really comes down to this last point here, is that the cost of ownership is so much higher that smaller businesses can't afford to set up a client-server architecture for the most part. They're forced to go with the peer-to-peer architecture. And until you have a larger organization with a lot more money, then you really can't go with a client-server architecture, or if you do, you're not going to be able to set it up properly. So that's the pros and cons of a client-server architecture compared to a peer-to-peer architecture. If you have any questions, let me know. I know we just skimmed the surface on this, but hopefully it gives you a level of detail and a better understanding of what these are if you haven't heard of them before, or if you have heard of them and you just didn't know that much. But if you do have any questions, as usual, let me know. Post your questions to the discussion board for the class. If not, thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next video.